Shorter the better.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the You Are Radically Loved Summit. We are joined by a very special speaker today. She has been a longtime friend. I consider her to be one of my teachers, mentor. I want to be her when I grow up, and I'm so excited to have her here. She's a best-selling author, meditation teacher, Tracee Stanley. Welcome to the You Are Radically Loved Summit.
Thank you so much for having me, Rosie. I'm happy to be here.
First of all, you were with me through this entire journey of this writing process because you were writing your book. I believe we started kind of doing this process at the same time, and
Mhm.
you you were so helpful for me, especially we're talking about being powerful. You are radically powerful. It's chapter 3 in the book, and I couldn't think of a better person to talk about this topic with than somebody who I consider to have an embodiment of that power internally, externally, in the most graceful and genuine, authentic way. So, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for even asking me. I'm so honored and excited.
I'm nerve sighted. I think I'm forever going to be nerve sighted about this whole process. The book writing process was an interesting, I guess still is, an interesting experience. And specifically this chapter, because the first few chapters, I'm really laying the groundwork of what this book is and what to expect, and really the beginnings of my journey. And it was so interesting when I was writing this specific chapter talking about empowerment or being powerful, and I felt so out of it. Like I was not in that embodiment of power, and I'm like, wow, this is the juxtaposition, right, of feeling a little bit disempowered or insecure, really is the word. It's not that I felt out of power. I just felt insecure about the writing process. And having mentors or people like you in my life that really help bring me back to um, this conduit of creativity and not getting too in my head about it. So I thought, great, this is the perfect place for Tracee to come and speak to. So what was your takeaway? What did you think about this chapter? Did it bring up anything that you want to share?
Oh, it brought up so much. The first thing that I would say is that I love how in the beginning of the chapter, you reference this idea of how we like things to be linear, right? We like our path to be linear so that we can know step by step and what's coming, and that the unknown is this scary thing that we try to run away from, right? And when we think about that, I feel like any time in my life that I've tried to control something or to have been arrogant or egotistical enough to think that I could control something, I got a big lesson. And the lesson was that I needed to surrender, and that the surrender little by little. And I also love that in the book, you talk about this idea of it's not just let go and you're done. It's kind of like let go just a little bit, practice letting go. And that practicing letting go, as you talk about in this chapter, is about presence, right? So my big takeaway from this was in reading just the first few lines of this chapter. And I really love that you start each chapter with kind of a mindfulness moment of presence, right? And that you end every chapter with a self-inquiry or journal prompt and a contemplation and practice, because that I feel like allows us to really embody and drop into what you're talking about in each chapter. But what I felt when I was reading it, specifically around this idea of things being linear, is this contraction in my body. And when I got further into the chapter and reading about your story, right, which is super vulnerable and inspiring to hear your story, and to read your story, I should say, is that I started to feel the letting go little by little as I kept reading about the journey. And then I started to feel this expansion by the end in my body by the end of the time that I got to the chapter. So my takeaway from this chapter, just as a whole, is that holding on and not acknowledging where we're fearful is this place of contraction. And observing and acknowledging where we are fearful and practicing just letting go is expansive. And that expansiveness is what we're moving towards if we really want to be powerful.
Yeah. Oh, I love what you said. I thank you for saying that. It's such an interesting experience to hear my people that I look up to, talk about their experience of something that I wrote. It's just like, oh, is this what you guys feel like? All my author friends, is this what it feels like? This is really, really just wild. It's a wild experience. I love what you're saying about the whole idea too of letting go little by little. And I think about conversations that we've had on the past. You know, you've been on the Radically Loved podcast a couple of times. You did the summit when we did the Radically Loved summit 2 years. It's been 2 years ago.
Wow.
I know. So when you think about this for yourself, like, is there a moment that you can think of where how did you learn to do this sort of slower letting go, or this incremental letting go? Like, is that a practice that you've done? Like, how, I guess I'm trying to figure out, like, how in your life has that worked, like how could we learn to do that? Because I feel like even though it has been my experience and it's been the most sustainable of my experiences to do things incrementally, I still have a really hard time doing it. It's like you teach what you need to learn. I think so. For you, like, what has that process been like? If you can give us an example?
Yeah, I think that this is why it's so important to write from our experience and to share our embodied understanding and knowledge through our writing, because it really was a book that I read many years ago that introduced me to this idea of letting go. And it wasn't even said in those words of letting go, right? But it definitely tied into another theme that's in this chapter, which is around this idea of the moment of chaos, right, is an absolute opportunity for the pause to be able to make a different choice. And so for me, it was a book that I read that was all about change and perspective and loss, and looking at loss in a different way. And so, funnily enough, after I read that book, about a month later, I had everything that I owned when I was in a different country stolen. And it was a moment of like, oh, I can see this from a different perspective. And it was just a moment of letting go. And it was almost as though, having read the book and other books that were similar, even though I didn't realize that seeds were being planted, they were being planted, and they allowed me to take that moment to allow them to sprout some fruit in the moment of what could have been seen as, oh my goodness, this is the most horrible thing in the world that could have happened to me. And so I think from that moment on, I started to look at every moment where I was present, not to say that I was like awake in that moment, but anytime that I had something where I felt like, is the gripping causing me more pain? Or is the letting go little by little going to allow me to be free? And so it's been a process over many, many years of literal practice. And if we think about it, the ultimate letting go is really death. So I can say that I am still practicing. because I'm still holding on to life, and I'm still holding on to, I'm in the process right now of clearing out my closet, right?
Oh,
And that's a process of letting go. There's a process of letting go of relationships that happen and business collaborations that can happen. And so I think that life presents us with all of these opportunities, if we are awake to them, to practice letting go gracefully.
yeah, I love that. There's a quote in the book that in this chapter that says everything that happens in your life is an opportunity to find a new meaning.
Mhm.
And I feel like this is exactly what you're saying. And hindsight is always 2020, right? We can look back and say like, wow, that was really, really great, that happened. I feel like the more you're able to do that, the easier it becomes to go into that state that you're talking about, the more expansive state, letting things go and not, attaching to, clinging on to something that's not serving us. But it definitely is a very difficult thing to do when you're in the moment, right? Because you're faced with having to make a decision that might feel like you're losing something. I mean, even something like you said, you're cleaning out, you're in the process of the closet clean. I just started doing the same exact thing and I had to stop. I'm like, oh God, because it's like, oh, I want to get rid of a ton of stuff. And then once I get in there, I'm like, oh, but this is like, I've had this t-shirt since high school. Like, even though I've never worn it, it's still like, it's not a concert t-shirt. It's not anything to do. It's just a shirt that I've had since high school. And I'm like, why is it still here? I don't wear her. I don't, it's time to let her go. But there's just something about that entire process that made me just walk out of the closet and be like, okay. I don't have a walk-in closet, by the way. It's a very small space. I'm like my walk-in, but like in my little space, that I'm just like crammed everything. I'm like, oh, I can't deal with this right now. If it's in there, it's fine. But I feel like sometimes with our emotions, like how many times do we do that with relationships in our lives that aren't serving our highest good, or situations that we're in that we feel, we can't get out of it. And, I talk about having the awareness and how awareness is the key agent to making change happen. And so for you, it was reading that book. And for me, it was also learning and observing the world at large and just kind of seeing what was possible. But there was no firsthand experience of what success looked like or what it looked like to make a different choice, because there was no modeling for me to sort of, like copy. So for you, when I actually want, the question I want to ask you about is the feeling of empowerment. And it's something that we've talked about before. So when you think of the word powerful, like what does that mean to you today? And what did it mean to you when you were a teenager?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. Um, so I would say that what it means to me now is truthful, authentic, aligned, visionary, capable, worthy. There's so many different words that come into my mind. What it feels like in my body is expansive, rested, present. And those are things that you can't buy. You're not going to buy your way to powerful. I don't care what kind of tonic you try to take. It's not happening.
It's not in a green juice.
No, it is
Can't
not
get it
in a
on
bottle.
Amazon. Yeah, totally.
And what it meant to me when I was a teenager um, was definitely much different, because what I was so introverted when I was a teenager, and I still am, but like painfully introverted. And so I would say when I would see people who seemed to be extroverted and seemed to be confident um, and maybe even seemed to be physically strong,
Mm.
um, successful, somehow at ease in their way. Um, I definitely felt that that was powerful. Um, but I don't think that I realized that there's so many masks that we wear that are not empowering. I had to learn that lesson later.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. I love that you're describing it in that way because I do it does resonate. You know, we put this false like this false facade, you know, for the
Mhm.
outside world to seem a certain way. And man, I can remember too, being in my early 20s when I first started working out in the world, and I was working at, you know, the hair salon. I was managing this salon at uh, the Beverly Center, and putting on this like, I am confident, I know what I'm doing.
Mhm.
Um, I'm reliable. And even though I didn't feel it. Like I had to sort of pretend to be this person that had their life together so that I could be taken seriously because I was so afraid that people were going to find out that I was, you know, I had a colorful background and that I was internally, I still felt like I was a bad person, right? Like I felt like I was a bad kid. I had that reputation of you were a troubled child, you'll be a troubled adult, you know? And I just felt
Yeah.
like I have to pretend to be this other person because this is the only way that it will help me sort of transform whatever this is. And it took many years to transform that. And it actually, the only way it did happen was through self inquiry and actually realizing that I wasn't that person, that I wasn't what everybody else's negative beliefs about me weren't real. I just bought into them. But I love what you're saying though about how, because we do it, I mean, I feel like in a way it can help us, but all, you know, it can help us cope, but also it can be very damaging if you don't do the work to really explore what's beneath the surface.
I'm so glad you're speaking to this because I think that, yes, it is helpful. Like we learn, right, from our parents. It's like I learned how to be on time. I learned how to show up. I learned how to have a work ethic, all of these different things. I learned the value of education, all of those things. Um, but you said something in the book about you discovered what your own personal beliefs were. And I think that that is a moment that's a kind of self initiation into power, because when we're young, we're really adapting other people's beliefs, right? It's like this is X, Y, and Z. And so we take it on as X, Y, and Z. And I think it's really important to really question some of the beliefs that we have and trace back, where did they come from? Is this something that you understand in your own knowing, or is it something that someone told you about yourself? And so now you're carrying that around. It's,
Yeah.
we can put it down.
Yeah. Oh, man, that's deep. I'm like, oh, that is deep. That's so deep because wow, yeah, that obviously really resonates with me because I feel like going back to what you said originally, that self-initiation or that self-awareness that it takes for you to say, yeah, I have to do this. I have to go into that closet and clear it out, right? I have to be able to um, forge myself through the fire. You know, it can be very daunting, but I feel that for anybody that's watching this, you know, anybody that follows me or follows Tracee or any of the other speakers at this summit, you're here because you have gone through or are going through that transformative process. And one of the one of the things that I felt very much going through this at different stages of my life was the desire for that internal power, that internal fire that I needed to anchor into myself to know that I was going to be okay, that I was going to survive, that it wasn't going to break me, that I was able to actually move through this experience and just make it through the other side. I didn't know what the other side was going to look like, but I
Mm.
knew that I would make it through, right? And sometimes that's the only encouragement or inner power that we have. You know, the only security that we have is to know that we are not going to let ourselves break, right? That we're not going to let ourselves drown, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many places in the book that kind of felt like those moments. And I have one question for you, which
Okay.
is about the moment you decided to get on the bus
Oh,
to SRF. Because to me, that felt like walking into the unknown. Like there had to have been a tremendous amount of courage for you. And so
yeah.
what was that moment like? Because I feel like that's a really powerful moment.
Wow. You know, it's so interesting, Tracee, because even as I was writing that, I didn't think about what you're asking. I didn't think about it at all. Because to me, it was like I got in and then I just got there. But it's interesting that you asked that, because the minute that you're asking me that, I went back into that place, even putting my change in the, you remember the old
Oh
school, you
yeah, I
put the
remember.
change through the little ning, 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 the little coin depositor.
Yep.
So I'm going with my like 50 cents or 35 cents. I can't remember how
I
much it
think
was.
35 probably back
Yep.
then.
And then I go and I, put my change in there, and it felt like, wow, even going back internally, it felt like I wasn't coming back. That gives me
Mm.
the chills. Like it felt like I'm not coming back from this. Like this this person is about to change. Like it felt like I was just sort of on this bus to nowhere. Like we don't know where we're going. We're just getting in and we're just going to go. And it's almost like this sort of very nebulous path that I wasn't necessarily, there was no fear. It almost felt like what you were talking about earlier, like that surrender was there. It's like, okay, like it felt like this is the last thing I'm going to try, you know?
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And which SRF self-realization fellowship did you go to?
The one on Vermont and Sunset, the one by
Beautiful. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
the
Yeah.
one,
The one.
the one. Yeah, and it was such and to me, I knew that route because my mom was at the time working at the Children's Hospital, which is like sort of catty corner
Hmm.
across the way there, and it was, yeah, I got there, and I just kind of walked in with my backpack, just kind of feeling like, okay, this is cool. It was actually the first, I want to say it was like one of the first times that I felt I didn't feel alone. Like that entire trip, most of the time whenever I traveled by myself, I always was very antsy about it because you're a young teenage girl on the bus in LA by yourself, and I was like ditching school, and I was just kind of always meeting friends, always meeting people. So it wasn't like I was by myself, but this was one of the only times that I felt I was alone, but I didn't feel like I was by myself, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, great
Amazing.
question. What a great question. Yeah, thank you so much for asking that. I've not ever thought about it, but for the people that are watching this, yeah, there's more. I elaborate more in the chapter, so if you're interested in this story, I definitely um, elaborate. It was sort of my first spiritual experience, my first spiritual awakening, I would say. And it was so, I think back now, and it was such a simple, it wasn't like the stars aligned and everything was just in perfect harmony, and then the butterfly flew across, and it wasn't anything like that. It was very much, I got on the bus, I got off on my stop, I went into the center, and I closed my eyes, and it just happened right then. There was that awareness, and now that we know, sort of going into the sublime energy of practice, of meditation, of rest, I had never experienced my body ever. That moment of, oh, notice your body, that awareness was like, oh, wow, it's almost like I lived that first, whatever, 15, 16 years of my life being out of body because of obviously going through and being in an environment where being disembodied was survival, right?
Yeah.
Because of the,
Yeah.
intensity, right? So it's almost like I was kind of living out here. And in that moment, I came back in here.
Mm, yeah. I
So,
love that. And I love the simplicity and that you really highlight this idea, or not even the idea, but the truth that spiritual awakening doesn't have to be some big bang happening. It can be something very simple. And I had a very similar experience where it was like out of nowhere, very simple, very graceful. And I think it's important for people to know, because I think that there's a lot of to-dos made about spiritual awakening that make it seem like it's something unattainable, when in truth, the awakening is also little by little, just like the letting go.
I love that so much. Tracee, thank you so much. I am so grateful for you. Thank you so much for always supporting me on my
Mm.
journey and on my path and my career and with everything I do, and supporting this book. It truly means so much to me, and I can't thank you enough. Thank you for all the work that you do, for everything that you put out in the world, for your commitment, devotion, and dedication to your students and to the world. I thank you from my heart.
Mm.
And so
Thank you. And you.
for everybody that's watching this, where can they connect with you or get more information?
Oh, you can connect with me at radiantrest.com. And that's where you'll find all the things, the website, the book, the podcast, and anything else.
So we will put the links to all of that in the description below. And okay, weird edit. Well, and don't forget to claim your free gift below as well. So thank you all so much for being here. And Tracee, thank you again so much. So we are heading into tomorrow's speaker, chapter 4, and I am so excited for you all to join us tomorrow. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for all of your support.